What if you woke up tomorrow with no memory of who you were, only to discover you'd been serving as a slave to the very men you'd sworn to bring to justice? For 8 months, federal agent Sarah Chen existed in a catatonic void, her mind shattered, her body used, her daughter stolen. But when a serpent tattoo on a customer's chest triggers her memories, everything comes flooding back. Now, one mother's quest for her missing child will paint the criminal underworld red with vengeance. Every broken memory fuels her transformation from victim to predator. And the men who destroyed her life are about to learn a terrifying truth. Some things should stay buried. Some people should stay dead. And some mothers will burn the whole world down to get their children back. This is Shattered Mirror. Part 1. Awakening. Chapter 1. The room existed in perpetual twilight. Heavy curtains drawn against a world that had ceased to matter. The air thick with the scent of cheap cologne and desperation that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Walls that had witnessed too much and said nothing, keeping their secrets like tombstones keep names. She sat on the edge of the bed, neither here nor there, neither present nor absent, existing in that strange liminal space between consciousness and oblivion where memories go to die, and the self becomes nothing more than a collection of reflexes responding to stimuli without thought or feeling or recognition of what any of it means. The man who entered brought with him the smell of cigarettes and rain, his heavy boots marking time against the stained carpet like a countdown to something inevitable. Though she couldn't have said what if anyone had bothered to ask, which they never did because asking would have required seeing her as something more than furniture, more than a vessel, more than the ghost she had become in this room, where time moved like molasses, and each day bled into the next without distinction or meaning. His hands were rough when they touched her face, turning it toward the dim light filtering through a crack in the curtains, examining her the way one might examine produce at a market, checking for bruises or signs of rot. And she let him because resistance required will, and will required self. And self was something she had misplaced somewhere along the way, lost in the fog that had swallowed her whole and refused to give her back. He pushed her back onto the bed with the casual indifference of someone who had done this before, would do it again, saw nothing remarkable in the transaction, except perhaps that she was prettier than most, despite the vacant stare and the way she moved like a marionette with half its strings cut. It was when he removed his shirt that everything changed. Though change is perhaps too simple a word for what happened in that moment when the world suddenly snapped into focus with the violence of a rubber band pulled too tight and finally released. The tattoo sprawled across his chest like a declaration of war, a serpent eating its own tail, wrapped around a bleeding heart pierced with 3 daggers. And the sight of it hit her nervous system like lightning striking water, sending electricity racing through neural pathways that had been dormant for so long they had almost forgotten how to function. The warehouse, Marcus laughing as he brought the pipe down, the feeling of her skull cracking like an egg, Lily screaming "Mommy" as they dragged her away. The memories didn't return gently like morning sun creeping through windows, but rather crashed into her consciousness, like a freight train derailing, each image more violent than the last. Years of training and experience, and identity flooding back into a mind that had been empty for so long. It almost couldn't contain the sudden influx of information that threatened to tear it apart at the seams. Special Agent Sarah Chen, deep cover, 18 months infiltrating the Serpent Brotherhood, and Marcus, beautiful lying Marcus with his gentle hands and killer's smile. Marcus, who had shared her bed and met her daughter and sworn he loved them both. Marcus, who had sold her out for 30 pieces of silver, or whatever the going rate was for federal agents these days. The man above her, lost in his own sordid fantasy, never saw it coming because men like him never expected their victims to be anything more than what they appeared. I never imagined that the broken doll beneath them might suddenly remember. She had once been a weapon forged in Quantico fires and tempered in streets where violence was currency and survival was an art form. Her hands moved with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, finding the precise point where the skull met the spine. applying pressure with the efficiency of someone who had been taught 100 ways to kill with her bare hands, and had practiced them all until they became as natural as breathing. The snap was almost delicate, like a dry branch breaking underfoot in autumn, and he collapsed onto her with his eyes still open in surprise, the last expression he would ever wear frozen on his face, like a photograph of the exact moment he ceased to exist. She pushed him off with strength she had forgotten she possessed, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud that would bring Rico running, because Rico always came running when there were sounds that suggested his merchandise might be damaged. Rico, who had kept her drugged and docile and earning for how long now? Weeks? Months? She couldn't be sure because time in this place was measured in violations rather than minutes. Standing felt strange after so long spent horizontal, her legs shaking not from weakness but from the rage that was building inside her, like a nuclear reactor approaching critical mass. Rage at Marcus, at Rico, at every man who had entered this room and taken what they wanted from her unconscious form. But most of all, rage at herself for walking into Marcus's trap with her eyes wide open, for letting her feelings cloud her judgment, for bringing Lily into a world where mothers could disappear and daughters could be leveraged. The door opened and Rico's bulk filled the frame, his piggish eyes taking in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone doing rapid cost-benefit analysis, weighing the loss of a customer against the trouble of disposing of a body. "What the fuck did you do, you stupid?" The sentence died in his throat, along with Rico himself, when she crossed the room in 2 fluid strides and drove her elbow into his larynx with enough force to crush his windpipe like a beer can, watching dispassionately as he clutched at his throat and tried to draw breath through passages that would never work again, his face turning an interesting shade of purple before he joined his customer on the floor, in a sprawl of limbs that would never move again under their own power. She stepped over him and into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cheap linoleum, every sense hyper-alert now that the fog had lifted, and she could see clearly for the first time in however long she had been trapped in this nightmare. The building was a maze of narrow corridors and closed doors, behind which she could hear the sounds of commerce and despair intermingling in a symphony of human degradation. But she had no time for rescue missions, not when every second that passed was another second. Lily remained in the hands of men who wore serpents on their skin and traded in human misery like it was cryptocurrency. Rico's office was at the end of the hall, a cramped space that reeked of marijuana and man-sweat, papers scattered across a desk that had seen better decades. And there among the debris she found what she was looking for: a cell phone, a wallet thick with cash, and most importantly, a loaded Glock that fit in her hand like it had been waiting for her all along. The phone was password protected, but Rico's wallet contained his driver's license, and she tried his birthday, because men like Rico were never as clever as they thought they were. The screen unlocking to reveal a contacts list full of names that meant nothing to her, except for one. Marcus Torres, listed simply as MT, with a number that she committed to memory, even as her finger hovered over the call button, wanting nothing more than to hear his voice, so she could promise him the kind of death that would make what she had done to his colleague look like mercy. But Sarah Chen hadn't survived 18 months undercover by being impulsive, hadn't risen through the ranks by letting emotion override tactics. So, instead, she scrolled through Rico's messages, finding the digital breadcrumbs that would lead her back to the world she had been ripped from. Each text a piece of the puzzle that was beginning to form a picture of just how deep this rabbit hole went. The Serpent Brotherhood wasn't just running drugs and guns anymore. They had expanded into human trafficking, using women like her as currency in deals that spanned the coast. And at the center of it all was Marcus. Marcus, who had graduated from street soldier to lieutenant. Marcus, who had kept Lily as insurance against the day Sarah might remember who she was. Chapter 2. The clothes she found in Rico's closet were too big, but they were better than the negligee she had been wearing, like a uniform of degradation. The jacket hiding the Glock tucked into jeans. She had to roll 3 times to keep from tripping over. And if she looked like a child playing dress-up, then so be it, because she had looked like worse things in this place. And at least now she looked like someone with agency, someone with purpose, someone with a mission that would end with blood on her hands and her daughter in her arms. The money in Rico's wallet was enough for a motel room where she could shower off the smell of captivity and plan her next move. Watching the water run brown, then pink, then clear, as months of accumulated misery swirled down the drain. And when she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman, staring back, cheekbones too sharp, eyes too hollow, a hair that had grown past her shoulders when she had always kept it short for practical reasons. But beneath the damage, she could see herself emerging like a photograph in Developer Solution. Sarah Chen, who had graduated third in her class at the academy, who had spent 5 years building cases against organizations like the Serpent Brotherhood, who had volunteered for deep cover because she believed in justice and thought she could make a difference. The phone she had taken from Rico's office rang while she was trying to decide whether to cut her hair with the scissors she had found under the bathroom sink. Marcus's name on the screen, making her heart rate spike in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation of what she would do when she finally found him. She let it ring through to voicemail, listening to his voice for the first time in months. "Rico! Where the fuck are you? The shipment's coming in tonight and I need you here." And memorizing not just the words but the casual arrogance in his tone, the assumption that everyone would always be exactly where he expected them to be. The shipment was coming in tonight, which meant Marcus would be at the warehouse, the same warehouse where he had cracked her skull and left her for dead, where this entire nightmare had begun with a kiss that tasted like betrayal and ended with her daughter's screams echoing off concrete walls. She knew she should call for backup, should reach out to her handler if he was still alive, if the agency still existed as far as she was concerned, if anyone even knew she was still breathing. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, and the only person she could rely on was the woman in the mirror who looked like she had crawled out of her own grave. The burner phone she bought from a convenience store with Rico's money felt strange in her hands. The number she dialed from memory belonging to a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else, someone who had believed in the system, in protocol, in the idea that good could triumph over evil if you just followed the rules and filed the right paperwork. The voice that answered was unfamiliar, young, probably fresh out of training. And when she gave her authorization code, there was a pause long enough to drive a truck through before he asked her to repeat it, then put her on hold with the kind of muzak that made her want to put a bullet through the phone. "Agent Chen?" The voice that finally came on the line was familiar, even if she couldn't immediately place it. Tired and official and carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering bad news. "This is Deputy Director Harrison. We need you to come in immediately. I need to know about my daughter," she said. Her voice rough from disuse, from screaming that she didn't remember, from months of silence that had settled in her throat like sediment. Lily Chen, age 7, taken approximately. She realized she didn't know how long she had been gone, how many birthdays had passed, how many inches Lily had grown, how many teeth she had lost. "Taken when I was compromised. Agent Chen, your daughter Island." Harrison paused, and in that pause she heard everything she needed to know. Felt the ground beneath her feet turn to quicksand. Understood that the world she was fighting to return to might not exist anymore. "We've been looking for you for 8 months. You were declared MIA, presumed dead. Your daughter was placed in protective custody initially, but what?" The words came out sharp enough to cut the Glock heavy in her hand. Rico's blood still under her fingernails despite the shower, the taste of violence in her mouth like copper pennies. "There was an incident. The safe house was compromised. Your daughter was taken 3 months ago. We've been trying to locate her, but the Serpent Brotherhood has gone underground, fractured into cells that..." She ended the call before he could finish, before he could explain how the entire federal government had failed to protect one 7-year-old girl, before he could offer platitudes and promises that meant nothing when weighed against the reality that Lily had been in their hands for 3 months. 3 months of God knows what, because she knew what these men were capable of, had seen it firsthand, had lived it in ways that would haunt her dreams forever, assuming she ever slept again. The warehouse address was burned into her memory like a brand. Every detail of that last night before the world went dark, crystal clear now that the fog had lifted the smell of motor oil and fear. The sound of Marcus's laughter echoing off concrete walls, the feeling of betrayal so complete It had almost been a relief when unconsciousness finally claimed her. It would be different this time, because this time she knew what he was, knew what they all were. Serpents who had shed their human skin to reveal the monsters underneath. And she would meet them as what she truly was: not a victim, not a ghost, not a broken doll, but an apex predator who had simply forgotten how to hunt. Chapter 3. The warehouse district at night looked like the aftermath of an economic apocalypse. Empty buildings standing like tombstones for industries that had moved overseas or simply ceased to exist. Windows broken into jagged smiles that reflected the moon in fragments that never quite added up to a whole. She parked Rico's car, because of course Rico had a car. A black sedan trying so hard to be inconspicuous. It practically screamed criminal enterprise 3 blocks away, and made her approach on foot. Every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible alarm. The building itself was exactly as she remembered it. 3 stories of brick and bad decisions. Loading docks that had once received legitimate cargo, now serving as entry points for product that destroyed lives one hit at a time. And somewhere inside was Marcus. Marcus who thought she was dead. Marcus who had no idea that death might have been a mercy compared to what was coming for him now. She could see lights in the windows on the 2nd floor. Shadows moving behind glass that hadn't been cleaned since the previous administration. And she counted bodies the way she had been trained: at least 6. Possibly more. All of them probably armed. None of them expecting a ghost to come calling. The service entrance she remembered from her undercover days was still there. The lock still broken because fixing things required, caring about tomorrow, and men like these lived entirely in the now. Taking what they wanted when they wanted it without thought for consequences that seemed as abstract as justice or karma, or the idea that the dead might not stay dead. The hallway beyond was dark, but she had walked it enough times to navigate by memory. Her feet finding their way around debris and detritus with the certainty of someone coming home, if home was a place where everything you loved had been destroyed. Voices drifted down from the 2nd floor. Marcus's rising above the others with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. And she followed the sound like a beacon. The Glock warm in her hand. Her heartbeat steady as a metronome counting down to an ending that had been written the moment he had decided she was expendable. The stairs creaked under her weight, but the sound was masked by laughter from above. The kind of laughter that came from men who had never been hunted, who had always been the ones doing the hunting, who wouldn't recognize their own mortality if it walked up and introduced itself. She paused at the top of the stairs, letting her eyes adjust to the fluorescent light spilling from the open door at the end of the hall, listening to the conversation that told her everything she needed to know about what she was walking into. The shipment had arrived. 20 kilos of heroin that would be cut and distributed across the city. And more importantly, the special cargo that would be processed tomorrow. Terminology that made her stomach turn, because she knew exactly what kind of cargo they meant, had been that cargo herself, until an hour ago. "What about the kid?" someone asked. And Sarah's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing like a spring wound too tight. "She's getting old enough to be trouble. The kid's my insurance policy," Marcus replied. And she could hear the smile in his voice. That same smile that had once made her feel safe, that had convinced her he was different from the others, that had been the most beautiful lie she had ever believed. Her mother might be gone, but the feds are still looking. As long as I have her, I'm untouchable. The rage that flooded through her system was pure and clean and absolute, burning away everything except the need to make him understand what he had taken from her, what he had turned her into, what was about to happen to his entire world. She stepped into the doorway like she was stepping onto a stage, the fluorescent lights harsh after the darkness of the hallway. And for a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody quite believed what they were seeing. Marcus was sitting at a table covered in product and money, looking exactly as she remembered him, beautiful in that dangerous way that made good girls make bad decisions, dark eyes that could look sincere even while lying, the serpent tattoo visible through his open collar like a warning label she had chosen to ignore. The recognition that dawned on his face was almost worth everything that had come before. The way his mouth opened but no sound came out. The way his hand moved toward the gun on the table but stopped halfway like he couldn't quite commit to the action. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence like a stone dropped in still water, ripples of disbelief spreading through the room as his men tried to process what they were seeing. "Miss me?" The man closest to her, someone she didn't recognize, someone who had joined after her time, reached for his weapon with the slow-motion inevitability of someone who didn't understand he was already dead. And she put 2 bullets in his chest before his hand even touched the grip, the sound explosively loud in the enclosed space, his body hitting the floor in a way that was becoming familiar. Chaos erupted as everyone moved at once, table flipping, money flying like confetti at the world's worst party, bullets cutting through air where she had been standing a second before. She moved through the room like a force of nature, like something elemental and unstoppable. Muscle memory and training taking over, where conscious thought would have been too slow. The Glock an extension of her will made manifest in copper and lead. Another man down, clutching his throat where her bullet had torn through. Another spinning away with his shoulder exploded into red mist. And through it all, she kept moving toward Marcus. Marcus, who had found his gun but couldn't seem to make his hands work properly. Marcus, who was scrambling backward like he could escape what was coming. Sarah. Wait. He started. And she almost laughed at the audacity of it. The idea that words could undo actions. That there was any combination of syllables that could make this right. "You don't understand. Where is she?" The question came out calm. Conversational even, though she had to raise her voice over the screaming of someone who had caught a bullet in the knee and was discovering that the movies lied about how much that hurt. "Where is my daughter?" "Safe," he said quickly, hands raised in supplication or surrender. She didn't care which. "She's safe. I swear. I kept her safe." "Safe?" She shot the man trying to crawl toward the door, more out of annoyance than anything else. His movement distracting from the conversation she had been waiting 8 months to have. Like I was safe? Like the other women in Rico's place were safe? That wasn't supposed to happen, Marcus said, and she could see him trying to find the angle, the words that would let him walk away from this, because Marcus always had an angle, always had an escape route planned. "You were supposed to die. Rico found you, thought you were just another junkie, didn't know who you were. By the time I found out, you were already gone. The person you were was gone, but you left me there." The words came out matter of fact, without emotion, because emotion would come later when she had time for it, when Lily was safe, when everyone responsible for this was in the ground. "You knew where I was, and you left me there. I couldn't risk exposing the operation," he said. Like that explained everything. Like that justified everything. Like the operation was more important than the woman who had loved him. More than the child who had called him daddy when her real father was just a ghost who had died overseas before she was born. "But Lily, I protected Lily. She doesn't know anything about what happened. She thinks you're on a long assignment. She's in school, she's... Where? If I tell you, you'll kill me. I'm going to kill you anyway." She said it like she was commenting on the weather, like it was simply a fact that existed independently of emotion or desire. Just another immutable law of the universe, like gravity or entropy. "But how much you suffer first depends on how quickly you tell me what I need to know." Chapter 4, the address Marcus gave her, gasping it out between screams when she started with his fingers, working her way up with the methodical patience of someone who had all the time in the world and none at all. Led to a house in the suburbs that looked so normal it felt like a hallucination. White picket fence that needed painting, lawn that needed mowing. The kind of place where normal families lived normal lives and didn't know that monsters could wear human faces and speak in human voices and break human hearts with such casual cruelty. She sat in the stolen car because Rico's sedan was now decorated with Marcus's blood and other fluids. She didn't want to think about watching the house, as dawn broke like a promise she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Trying to reconcile this mundane setting with the gothic horror of the last 8 months, a woman emerged to collect the newspaper, middle-aged and motherly in a bathrobe that had seen better days. And Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger of the Glock before she saw the truth of it. This woman didn't have the hardness that came from knowing what kind of business paid for her groceries, didn't have the careful blindness of someone choosing not to see. A hired guardian then, someone Marcus had paid to ask no questions and cash the checks. Someone who probably thought she was caring for the daughter of a traveling businessman or a deployed soldier. Some lie that would explain the absence of parents and the abundance of money. Sarah waited until the woman went back inside, then circled around to the back of the house, where she could see through kitchen windows that needed cleaning into a scene so domestic, it made her chest ache with something that might have been longing if she still had the capacity for. Such gentle emotions. Lily was sitting at a table eating cereal, and the sight of her hit Sarah like a physical blow, like all the air had been sucked out of the world, leaving nothing but vacuum, and the terrible pressure of love that had nowhere to go. She was taller, her hair longer, wearing pajamas Sarah didn't recognize, and she was laughing at something on the small TV mounted on the counter. So alive and present and real that for a moment Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at this miracle. This proof that something good had survived the wreckage. The back door was locked, but locks were suggestions to someone who had been trained to see every building as a puzzle waiting to be solved. And she was inside before she could second-guess herself, before she could wonder if Lily would recognize her. If 8 months was long enough for a 7-year-old, 8-year-old now, she had missed a birthday to forget her mother's face. The woman in the bathrobe was saying something about getting ready for school when she walked into the kitchen and stopped mid-sentence, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise that might have been comical in other circumstances. "Mummy?" The word hung in the air, like a question and an answer and a prayer all at once. Lily's spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. Milk dripping onto the table, in a steady rhythm that seemed to mark time in this moment that existed outside of time. And Sarah dropped to her knees, because standing suddenly seemed impossible. Opened her arms, because what else could she do? And Lily crashed into her with the force of 8 months of missing compressed into a single collision that knocked them both to the floor. "I knew you'd come back," Lily whispered into her shoulder, small arms wrapped around her neck with desperate strength. "Marcus said you were working, but I knew you'd come back. You always come back." Sarah held her daughter and let herself feel it for the first time. Really feel it, the weight of what had been done to her. The price of what she had done in return. The bodies left in her wake, and the blood on her hands that no amount of soap would ever really wash clean. But Lily was warm and solid and real in her arms, smelling like strawberry shampoo in childhood. And that was enough. That was everything. That was worth becoming the monster she had needed to become to get here. "We have to go," she said, pulling back to look at her daughter's face. Memorizing the changes, the new gap where a tooth had been, the way her eyes were still the same even if everything else was different. "Pack a bag. Just what you need. Where are we going? Somewhere safe. Somewhere new. Somewhere they can't find us." Because the Serpent Brotherhood was bigger than just Marcus and his crew. Because there would be retribution for what she had done. Because the agency would want her to come in for debriefing. And she had no intention of letting anyone else decide what happened next. She had been a good soldier once, had followed orders and trusted the system and believed in justice. But that woman had died in a warehouse 8 months ago. And what had emerged from Rico's den of degradation was something else entirely. Something that didn't fit into official reports or proper channels. The woman in the bathrobe misses. Patterson, according to the mail on the counter, was pressed against the wall, trying to become invisible. And Sarah felt something that might have been pity if she had any emotion to spare for strangers who had unknowingly participated in her nightmare. She pulled out what was left of Rico's money, blood-stained bills that told their own story, and left them on the counter like payment for services rendered or silence bought. But she didn't care which, as long as it bought them time. "You never saw us," she said, and Mrs. Patterson nodded so hard, Sarah worried her head might fall off. The kind of agreement that came from recognizing a predator and wanting nothing more than to survive the encounter. Part 2. Hunters and Hunted. Chapter 5. The motel room in Kansas smelt like cigarette smoke and broken dreams, but it was 3 states away from anyone who might be looking for them, and that made it paradise as far as Sarah was concerned. Even if the water ran brown before it ran clear, and the bed springs sang a symphony of rust every time one of them moved. Lily was asleep beside her, curled into a comma, with her hand fisted in Sarah's shirt, like she was afraid her mother might disappear again if she let go. And Sarah watched her breathe in the light from the parking lot that filtered through curtains too thin to block anything out. They had been running for 3 weeks now, zigzagging across the country in stolen cars that she abandoned every few hundred miles, paying cash for everything, avoiding cameras with a kind of paranoid precision that came from knowing exactly how good facial recognition had gotten while she was gone. The Serpent Brotherhood had put a price on her head that had every two-bit hustler with delusions of competence looking for a woman and a child, but they were looking for a victim. And what they would find was something else entirely. She had already left 3 would-be bounty hunters in shallow graves along the highway. Men who had thought a woman traveling alone with a child would be easy prey. Who had learned too late that maternal instinct combined with federal training and 8 months of stored rage made for a cocktail that burned going down and left nothing but ashes in its wake. She felt nothing when she killed them. No guilt, no satisfaction, just the same empty efficiency that had carried her through the warehouse, through Marcus's execution, through the systematic dismantling of everything the man she had loved had built. The phone she had taken from one of the dead men buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. But the message made her blood run cold. "We have your handler. Come home or he dies." Attached was a photo of Agent Davidson, her former handler, the man who had recruited her out of the academy and taught her everything about undercover work, tied to a chair with his face painted in bruises that looked like modern art. She recognized the room behind him, another warehouse, because men like these lacked imagination, and she knew it was a trap. Knew they were counting on her loyalty to a man who had been like a father to her. They were right. "Lily, honey, wake up!" She gently shook her daughter's shoulder, hating herself for disrupting the only peace the girl had found in weeks, but knowing that staying still meant death for all of them. "We need to go." "Again?" Lily's voice was thick with sleep, but she was already sitting up, already reaching for the backpack that contained everything they owned now, trained by 3 weeks of running to be ready to move at a moment's notice. Where to this time? Back to where it started. Sarah said, checking the Glock's magazine even though she knew it was full, had checked it obsessively every few hours like a rosary of bullets that might grant absolution if she just counted them enough times. "But first, I need to make you safe." The call she made was to a number she hadn't dialed in years. A favor she had never wanted to cash in, but that seemed like the only option now that everything was converging toward a conclusion she couldn't avoid. Sister Mary Catherine answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice exactly as Sarah remembered it from the foster home where she had spent 2 years after her parents died, before she aged out and joined the bureau, before she met Marcus, before everything went to hell. "Sarah? Child? Is that you? I need your help," Sarah said without preamble, because there wasn't time for catching up, for explaining how she had gone from promising recruit to whatever she was now. "My daughter needs somewhere safe to stay for a few days." "Of course," Sister Mary Catherine said without hesitation. Because that was who she was, someone who helped without questions, who understood that sometimes salvation came in strange packages. "You know where to find me." The convent was 6 hours away, tucked into mountains that seemed to exist outside of time, where cell service was spotty and strangers were noticed, where nuns who had taken vows of silence would nevertheless scream quite loudly if someone tried to harm a child under their protection. Sarah drove through the night while Lily slept, pushing the stolen Camry to its limits on dark highways, where every set of headlights might be death catching up. "I don't want to stay here," Lily said when they pulled up to the gates just as dawn was breaking over the mountains like God's own spotlight. "I want to stay with you." "I know, baby," Sarah said, pulling her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize everything about this moment because she wasn't sure there would be another one. "But I have to go finish something, and I need to know you're safe while I do it. You're going after the bad men." It wasn't a question. And Sarah was struck again by how much her daughter had aged in the weeks since their reunion. Childhood burning away like morning mist to reveal someone harder. Someone who understood that the world contained monsters, and sometimes monsters had to be fought with monstrous methods. "Yes. Will you come back?" Sarah wanted to lie. wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that they would be together again soon, that this was just another temporary separation, but Lily deserved better than pretty lies. I deserved the truth, even if it hurt going down. I'm going to try. Try harder, Lily said fiercely. And then she was gone, running through the gates without looking back. Sister Mary Catherine's arms opening to receive her like she had been waiting for this moment. And Sarah drove away before she could change her mind, before she could grab her daughter and keep running forever, before she could choose love over vengeance. Chapter 6. The warehouse district looked different in daylight, less menacing and more pathetic, like seeing a horror movie monster without its makeup. All the seams and zippers visible in the harsh light of day. She parked 3 blocks away, same as before, but this time she didn't bother with stealth because they were expecting her, had Davidson as bait and thought that made them the hunters instead of the hunted. Not understanding that she had become something that didn't care about its own survival as long as it could take them all with her when she went. The front door was open, an invitation that was also a taunt, and she walked through it like she was walking into church. If church was a place where she intended to create new angels by sending souls to meet their maker. The main floor was empty, but she could hear voices echoing from above, Davidson's among them, which meant he was still alive. They were still useful as leverage they didn't realize had already expired, because the Sarah who would have negotiated for a handler's life had died 8 months ago, and what remained was just purpose wrapped in flesh that happened to look like her. She climbed the stairs openly, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, announcing her arrival like a dinner bell for wolves who didn't realize they had invited a tiger to the feast. The room at the top was full of them, at least a dozen members of the Serpent Brotherhood, all armed, all watching the door, all thinking they had her outnumbered and outgunned, not understanding that mathematics meant nothing when one side of the equation had already accepted death as a foregone conclusion. Davidson was in the center of the room, tied to a chair as advertised, but his eyes, when they met hers, were trying to tell her something, warning her of something beyond the obvious trap. And she processed the information in the split second, before everything went sideways. The bruises were old, at least a week, which meant they had taken him before she had even escaped from Rico's, which meant this had been planned for longer than she had realized, which meant, "Hello, Sarah." The voice came from behind her, and she turned slowly, unsurprised to find Deputy Director Harrison standing there with a gun pointed at her head, because, of course, it was Harrison. Of course the corruption went that high. Of course the system she had believed in had been rotten from the core all along. He looked older than she remembered, greyer, like betrayal had aged him in dog years, or maybe that was just what selling your soul did to your complexion. "Let me guess," she said, her voice conversational despite the dozen guns now pointed at her, despite the certainty that she was going to die in this room, despite everything. "They paid you more than the government." "It's not about money," Harrison said, and he sounded genuinely offended, like she had accused him of something worse than treason. "It's about reality. The war on drugs is unwinnable, so why not manage it instead? Control the flow, minimize the violence, everybody wins." "Everybody wins?" She laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several of the men flinch. "Tell that to the women in Rico's place. Tell that to the families destroyed by the poison you're pumping into the streets. Tell that to my daughter. Your daughter was never supposed to be involved," Harrison said, like that absolved him. Like intention mattered when the results were written in blood and trauma. Marcus went rogue, made it personal. We've been trying to clean up his mess ever since. We? She looked around the room, counting faces, memorizing features, calculating angles and trajectories with the part of her brain that had become a battlefield computer. "How many of you are federal agents? How many of you took an oath to protect and serve and then sold it for 30 pieces of silver?" No one answered, but she could see it in their faces, the ones who looked away, the ones who had the grace to appear ashamed. At least 3, maybe 4, brothers in arms who had become brothers in betrayal. And the rage that filled her was so pure it felt like religious ecstasy, like speaking in tongues, like the kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to happen next. "You can't win this," Harrison said, trying for reasonable. trying for the voice of authority that had once made her snap to attention. "Put down the gun. Come in. We'll work something out. Your daughter needs you alive." "My daughter needs me to be someone she can respect," Sarah said. And then she was moving, not toward Harrison, but toward Davidson. Because if she was going to die in this room, she was going to die trying to save the one person here who might still deserve saving. The first bullet took her in the shoulder, spinning her around but not stopping her forward momentum. And she used the spin to her advantage. The Glock in her hand, speaking its own language of violence. 2 men down before they even realized she wasn't trying to escape, but to engage, to take as many of them with her as possible. The second bullet caught her in the ribs, cracking something important, making breathing suddenly difficult. But breathing was optional when you only needed to survive for another 30 seconds. She reached Davidson and cut his bonds with the knife she had taken from Marcus's corpse. A souvenir she had been saving for a special occasion. And this seemed special enough. Davidson's eyes wide with something that might have been admiration or horror. She couldn't tell and didn't care. He took the gun from the man she had just killed and joined the fight. The two of them back to back like they had trained for all those years ago. Before undercover work. Before betrayal. Before everything got complicated. "You should have stayed away," he gasped, blood running from a reopened wound on his forehead. "You should have found better friends," she replied, putting 3 bullets into someone who might have been an agent, might have been a criminal, the distinction no longer mattering in this room where everyone was guilty of something. Harrison was screaming orders that no one was following because chaos had its own momentum, and once blood started flowing, it was hard to stop. Bodies falling like dominoes, the air thick with gunsmoke and the copper scent of mortality. And through it all, Sarah kept moving, kept shooting, kept fighting, even as her body registered damage that would require a medical examiner to fully catalogue. The third bullet took her in the thigh, dropping her to one knee, but not stopping her from putting her last round through the throat of a man who had been reaching for Davidson. Watching him clutch at the wound with the confused expression of someone who had never considered their own death as a possibility, until it was a probability, and then a certainty, all in the space between heartbeats. She was out of ammunition, but not out of fight. Using the knife now, the blade finding soft spots between ribs, opening arteries with the precision of a surgeon who had studied anatomy in reverse, learning how to destroy what others learned to heal. Someone's hands were around her throat, but she drove the knife backwards and they loosened, fell away, became just another piece of meat in a room that was starting to look like an abattoir. Chapter 7. When the smoke cleared and the sirens grew closer, only 3 people remained standing in that charnel house of justice and revenge. Sarah, barely, leaning against a wall and trying to hold her insides inside, with pressure that wasn't quite enough. Davidson, looking like he had gone 10 rounds with a wood chipper and lost. And Harrison, somehow untouched in the middle of all that carnage. His suit still clean, his gun still steady, pointed at her head with the confidence of someone who thought the story ended here. "It didn't have to be this way," he said, and she could hear genuine regret in his voice, like he was mourning the loss of something that had never really existed. "You could have stayed gone, stayed dead, let sleeping dogs lie. I was never very good at playing dead," she said, blood bubbling on her lips with each word, painting them red like lipstick made of life, leaving her body one drop at a time. "And you were never very good at knowing when to quit while you were ahead." He frowned, not understanding, not seeing Davidson moving behind him with the slow certainty of someone who had made a choice and was following through regardless of consequences. The sound of the hammer cocking on Davidson's gun was loud in the sudden silence, and Harrison's eyes widened with the understanding that came too late. Always too late. That betrayal was a 2-way street, and someone was always the last to know they had been betrayed. "Don't," Harrison said. But it wasn't clear who he was talking to. Davidson with the gun to his head, or Sarah with her hand moving toward the knife, still lodged in the corpse at her feet. "You killed them all," Davidson said, his voice hollow with the weight of what he was about to do, what he had to do, what honor demanded even if the law would call it murder. Every agent who wouldn't turn, who wouldn't take your money, who believed in something more than profit margins. You killed them and called it necessary casualties, acceptable losses, the price of doing business. The agency will come after you, Harrison said, trying for threatening but achieving only desperate. You'll be hunted. You'll never be safe. Neither will you, Davidson replied, and pulled the trigger. The sound final and absolute. Harrison's body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut all at once. No grace in death, just meat returning to its natural state. Sarah slid down the wall, leaving a red trail like a signature. Her body finally acknowledging what her will had been ignoring, that she was dying. Had been dying since the first bullet found her. Was only still conscious through spite and stubbornness, and the refusal to leave before the job was done. Davidson knelt beside her, his hands trying to stop bleeding that had no intention of stopping, whispering words she couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears that sounded like the ocean, like a storm, like the end of everything. Lily, she managed to say through lips that didn't want to work anymore. Take care of Lily. I will, he promised. And she believed him because Davidson had never lied to her, had been the one good thing in a system full of rot, who had saved her as much as she had saved him, even if salvation looked like a warehouse full of corpses and a future full of running. She thought about Lily, safe with the nuns, growing up without her but alive, free, unpoisoned by the violence that had consumed everything else, and found that was enough. That was everything. I mean, that was worth becoming a monster if it meant her daughter could remain human. The darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision wasn't frightening, but almost welcome. A chance to rest after 8 months of fighting. 8 months of surviving. 8 months of becoming something that couldn't exist in the daylight anyway. But the body was stubborn even when the mind was ready to let go. And she found herself still breathing when the EMTs arrived. Still conscious when they loaded her into the ambulance. Still aware enough to hear Davidson telling them she was a federal agent, that she needed protection, that she was a hero even if the story they would tell wouldn't include most of the truth, because the truth was too ugly for official reports. The hospital room she woke up in 3 days later was white and clean and felt like another kind of prison. But Davidson was there in a chair beside her bed, looking like he had aged a decade in those 3 days. And he had news that made the pain worth it. The Serpent Brotherhood was finished, the corruption in the agency exposed, and Lily was safe. Would always be safe, because sometimes the system worked, even when you had to break it first to fix it. She wants to see you, Davidson said, and Sarah could hear the question in it, whether she was ready, whether she could be the mother Lily needed instead of the weapon she had become. Not yet, Sarah said, though it killed her to say it, though every cell in her body screamed for her daughter. Not until I'm sure it's really over. Because she could feel it in her bones, in the parts of her that had been rewired by trauma and violence, that this was just the eye of the storm, that there were still serpents out there who needed to be introduced to the concept of extinction, that the woman who had walked into that warehouse to save her handler wasn't done becoming whatever she was becoming. Part 3. What Remains. Chapter 8. 6 months later, Sarah stood in another warehouse, this one in Miami, watching the last lieutenant of the Serpent Brotherhood bleed out at her feet, while tropical rain hammered on the metal roof like applause from an angry god. She had told Davidson she needed to be sure it was over, and she had meant it. Had spent half a year following every lead, hunting down every connection, turning over every rock that might hide something venomous. The official story was that she was on medical leave, recovering from her injuries, dealing with the trauma of her ordeal. But the truth was that she had become something like a force of nature, appearing in cities across the country wherever the Brotherhood tried to reconstitute itself, leaving bodies and burning operations in her wake like signatures on a masterpiece painted in violence and retribution. The agency knew but chose not to know, filing her activities under unsanctioned but useful, the kind of plausible deniability that let them benefit from her work without taking responsibility for it. She had visited Lily twice in those 6 months, brief meetings supervised by Sister Mary Catherine, who looked at her with eyes that saw too much and said too little, understanding that some transformations were irreversible, that the woman who had left her daughter at the convent was not the same woman who returned, would never be that woman again. Lily had been cautious at first, then angry, then finally accepting in the way children learn to accept that adults were complicated and broken and doing their best with the pieces they had left. "Are you coming home?" Lily had asked during the last visit. And Sarah had wanted to say yes, wanted to pretend that home was still a concept that applied to her. But honesty was the only gift she had left to give. "I don't know," she had said, and Lily had nodded like she understood, which was worse than tears would have been. This premature wisdom that no 8-year-old should possess. Now, standing in the warehouse with rain washing blood toward drains that would carry it to the ocean, where it would become part of something larger, diluted until it meant nothing. She pulled out her phone and called Davidson, who answered on the first ring like he had been waiting. Which he probably had, because Davidson knew her better than she knew herself these days. "It's done," she said. And she meant all of it. The brotherhood, the vengeance, the transformation from human to weapon and possibly, hopefully, back to something resembling human again. "Good," he said, and she could hear relief in his voice, maybe even pride, though pride in what she had become seemed misplaced. "There's something else, something you need to know." "Harrison had records," Davidson said. "Hidden, encrypted. But we found them. Names, dates, payments. The Brotherhood was just one tentacle of something bigger. There are other organizations, other connections, reaching into places we haven't even imagined yet." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it, the never-ending nature of it. The idea that cutting off one head just revealed how many more there were, Hydra-like and eternal. How far does it go? We don't know yet, but far. International, certainly. Corporate, probably. Government, definitely. She thought about Lily, about the promise of safety that might have been another beautiful lie, about the idea that there would always be another warehouse, another serpent, another threat that needed to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. "What are you asking me?" "I'm not asking anything," Davidson said carefully. "I'm just telling you that if someone wanted to continue operating in an unofficial capacity, cleaning up messes that officially don't exist, the agency wouldn't object. Couldn't object, really, since they wouldn't know about it. A ghost," she said. Understanding what he was offering, not redemption, not a return to what she had been, but purpose for what she had become. "Ghosts don't exist," Davidson replied. "But if they did, they would be very useful for dealing with things that also don't officially exist." Sarah looked at the body at her feet, the last official member of the Serpent Brotherhood, and realized that this ending was also a beginning, that the skills she had acquired through trauma could be repurposed for something that wasn't quite justice, but was closer than vengeance. She could be the thing that hunted monsters, the nightmare that kept the real nightmares in check, the ghost in the machine of corruption that gummed up the works and made the bad men look over their shoulders. "Lily stays protected," she said, her one non-negotiable condition. "Always. And I work alone." "Of course. And when I'm done, really done, you help me disappear. New identities for both of us. Somewhere clean, somewhere safe." Agreed. She hung up without saying goodbye, because goodbyes implied endings, and this wasn't an ending so much as a transition, an evolution, a metamorphosis that had begun in a warehouse with a pipe to her skull and might never really finish. The rain was starting to slack off, sun breaking through clouds in rays that looked like spotlights picking out a stage where she was the only actor left standing. She walked out of the warehouse and into the humid Miami afternoon, leaving the past behind in a puddle of blood and rainwater, moving toward a future that wasn't bright but wasn't dark either, existing in that grey area where necessity met morality and usually won. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Davidson coordinates, a name, a photo of someone who trafficked in children and thought their money made them untouchable. They were wrong, of course. Everyone was touchable if you were willing to become the kind of thing that did the touching. If you were willing to sacrifice your soul on the altar of other people's safety. If you were willing to be the monster so others didn't have to be. Sarah got into her rental car and drove toward the airport, toward the next city, the next warehouse, The next serpent that needed to be taught that even predators could become prey if the hunter was motivated enough. Chapter 9. 2 years passed in a blur of hotel rooms and blood, each mission blending into the next until she could barely remember which city she was in, which organization she was dismantling, which corrupt official she was removing from the board, like a chess piece that had outlived its usefulness. She had become something of a legend in certain circles, whispered about in the dark corners where evil men made evil plans. A boogeyman for boogeyman. The thing that went bump in the night for people who thought they owned the darkness. Lily was 10 now, thriving at a boarding school that Davidson had arranged, paid for with money Sarah didn't ask about, because some gifts shouldn't be examined too closely. She visited when she could, always looking over her shoulder, always ready to disappear if danger came too close. But it never did, because the people who might threaten her daughter had learnt that Sarah Chen was not someone whose child you touched, unless you wanted to discover how creative a motivated mother could be with common household. Objects. She was in Detroit, watching an arms dealer through a scope from a building across the street, waiting for him to step into just the right position where the bullet would find him and look like a rival's work rather than government-sanctioned assassination that didn't officially happen. When her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, she almost ignored it. But something, call it instinct or paranoia or the hypervigilance that kept her alive, made her answer. "Hello, Sarah." The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it immediately, filed away in some part of her memory that she had locked for her own protection. And then it hit her like cold water, like electricity, like 8 months condensed into a single moment of recognition. It was Marcus's voice, impossible as that was, because she had watched him die, had felt his pulse stop under her fingers, had confirmed the kill with the thoroughness of someone who didn't believe in resurrection. "You're dead," she said, her voice steady even as her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. "Death is relative," the voice replied. And now she could hear the difference. The slight electronic distortion that suggested this wasn't Marcus, but someone using his voice. Someone who wanted to throw her off balance, make her doubt what she knew to be true. But then, you know all about that, don't you? The woman who came back from the dead to kill everyone who wronged her. Who is this? Someone who's been watching you, Sarah, studying you, learning from you. You've been so busy looking for snakes, you never noticed the spider weaving a web around you. The arms dealer stepped into position, but she didn't take the shot. Couldn't, with her concentration fractured by this voice from the past that wasn't really from the past. This ghost that wasn't really a ghost. This threat that felt more real than anything she had faced in 2 years of hunting. "What do you want?" "To offer you a choice. Keep doing what you're doing, killing foot soldiers while the generals stay safe. Or join us and make a real difference. The system you're protecting is just as corrupt as the one you're fighting. You know this. You've seen it. Why not work for people who are at least honest about what they are? You mean work for murderers and traffickers? We prefer to think of ourselves as pragmatists. The world is what it is, Sarah. You can either shape it or be shaped by it." Marcus understood that, eventually. Marcus is dead. Marcus is transformed. Just like you. The only difference is that he embraced it while you're still fighting it. Still pretending you're one of the good guys when you've killed more people in the last 2 years than he did in his entire career. She wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat because there was truth in them. Uncomfortable truth, the kind that woke her up at 3 in the morning wondering if she had become the very thing she had set out to destroy. If the only difference between her and them was who signed her paychecks. If justice and vengeance were just different words for the same act of violence. "I'll give you time to think about it," the voice continued. "But not too much time. The world is changing, Sarah, and you need to decide which side of that change you want to be on." The line went dead, and she was left staring through the scope at a target she no longer felt certain about killing. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because she wasn't sure she deserved to be the one making that decision. Playing God with a rifle and a clear line of sight. Pretending it was justice when really it was just murder with better paperwork. She took the shot anyway, because that was who she was now, someone who finished the job regardless of philosophical complications. And watched the arms dealer crumple to the ground. his security scrambling like ants whose hill had been kicked. None of them looking up at her position because people never looked up, never expected death to come from above like judgment from an angry deity. But as she broke down the rifle and prepared to disappear into the Detroit night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed, that the voice on the phone had planted a seed of doubt that would grow into something she couldn't control, that the neat division between us and them, good and evil, justice and vengeance, was starting to blur in ways that made her question everything she had done since crawling out of that bed in Rico's den of misery. Chapter 10. The meeting was set for neutral ground. A diner in Nevada, middle of nowhere, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and pie and didn't ask questions about the woman sitting alone in the corner booth at 3 a.m. Sarah arrived 2 hours early, checking exits, counting civilians, calculating angles of fire and paths of escape with the automatic precision of someone who had learned that paranoia was just another word for preparation. He walked in exactly at 3, and despite the voice on the phone, despite 2 years of certainty, her heart stopped for a moment because it looked like Marcus, moved like Marcus, smiled like Marcus. That same dangerous smile that had once made her feel safe and now made her finger twitch toward the gun under her jacket. But as he got closer, she could see the differences. The scars that hadn't been there before, the slight mechanical stiffness in his left arm, the way his eyes were the same color, but somehow empty of whatever had made them Marcus's eyes. "Hello, Sarah," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. And the voice was perfect. Too perfect. Like an AI trained on recordings, but missing the tiny imperfections that made someone human. "You're not Marcus." "No," he agreed easily, pouring himself coffee from the pot the waitress had left on the table. "Marcus is dead. You made sure of that. Very thorough work, by the way. The cervical fracture was textbook, but the follow-up with the knife to the carotid? That was personal. Who are you?" "Ah? I'm what Marcus was supposed to become before you interrupted the process. A next-generation asset, enhanced and upgraded for the New World Order." Marcus was the prototype, but he let emotion compromise the mission. "I won't make that mistake. The Brotherhood is finished," Sarah said, keeping her hand close to her weapon, ready for this to go sideways, even though every instinct said this thing that looked like Marcus wasn't here to fight. Not yet. The Brotherhood was a proof of concept, nothing more. A demonstration that traditional law enforcement could be corrupted, co-opted, turned into an asset rather than an obstacle. It succeeded beyond our wildest expectations, thanks in part to you. I destroyed it. You refined it, showed us the weaknesses in the model, the places where human emotion created vulnerabilities. We've learned from your example, Sarah. The next generation won't have those weaknesses. The waitress approached to refill coffee, but something in Sarah's expression made her turn away, and they were left alone in their booth island, two predators discussing the nature of predation over coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and broken dreams. "What do you want?" "To offer you a place in what's coming. You've spent 2 years playing whack-a-mole with symptoms while the disease metastasizes. We're offering you a chance to be part of the cure. Your cure is worse than the disease." "Is it?" The thing wearing Marcus's face leaned forward, and she could see circuitry or something like it gleaming beneath the skin at his temple. Technology merging with biology in ways that shouldn't be possible, but apparently were. "How many people have you killed in the last 2 years? How many of them had families, children, lives that mattered to someone? You've become death incarnate. And for what? The system you're protecting is just as corrupt as the one you're fighting. The only difference is paperwork and pretense. I protect innocent people. You protect the status quo. And the status quo includes poverty, addiction, exploitation, all the things that create the market for what we provide. We don't cause the demand, Sarah. We just supply it efficiently." She wanted to argue, but found herself thinking about Lily. About the world she was growing up in. About whether that world was really any better for all the blood Sarah had spilled in its name. The monster across from her might be wrong about many things, But he wasn't wrong about the futility of what she had been doing. The endless nature of it. The way each victory just revealed 2 new battles that needed fighting. "I need proof," she heard herself saying, surprising them both. Proof that Marcus is really dead. That this isn't some elaborate manipulation. The thing smiled with Marcus's mouth, reached into its jacket, and pulled out a small device that projected a hologram into the air between them, security footage she had never known existed, showing her last moments with Marcus in excruciating detail, including the final cut that had ensured he would never get up again. It was hard to watch even for her, the methodical brutality of it, the way she had confirmed the kill with redundant violence, making absolutely certain that dead meant dead. Satisfied? She nodded, though satisfaction wasn't the right word for what she felt, which was more like confirmation of something she had always known, but needed to see that she had become the kind of monster that other monsters recruited, that her transformation was complete and irreversible, that the only question now was what to do with what she had become. "I need time to think." 24 hours. The thing that wasn't Marcus said, standing with that same mechanical stiffness. "Then we'll be in touch with the location. Come alone, come unarmed, or don't come at all." It walked out into the Nevada night, leaving her alone with cold coffee and the weight of a decision that felt like it might determine not just her future, but the future of the war between order and chaos that she had been fighting, without ever really understanding the rules. She thought about calling Davidson, about asking for guidance or backup or just someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for considering this. But she knew what he would say, that she had been under too much stress, that she needed to come in, that there were resources available for agents who had gone too deep and lost themselves in the darkness. But she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was, at a crossroads between 2 versions of damnation, trying to decide which one might leave room for something like redemption, even if she no longer believed redemption was possible for someone who had done what she had done, become what she had become, embraced the monster so completely that she could no longer remember what it felt like to be human. Epilogue. Ghost in the Machine. 5 years later, Sarah stood on a rooftop in Tokyo, watching the city pulse with neon life through the scope of a rifle that had no serial number, no history, no existence outside of this moment and this purpose. The target was a businessman who trafficked in organs harvested from refugees, a monster hiding behind respectability and lawyers, untouchable by conventional law enforcement, but very touchable by someone who didn't officially exist. She had never taken the offer from the thing wearing Marcus's face, had instead disappeared completely, severing all ties with the agency, with Davidson, with everything except Lily, who was 15 now and thought her mother was dead. The kindest lie Sarah had ever told, delivered through Davidson, before she vanished, complete with a funeral and a headstone and a trust fund that would see her daughter through college and beyond. Sarah Chen was dead, had died in that warehouse in Miami, or maybe earlier in Detroit, or maybe even earlier in that room in Rico's den where she had awakened to find herself transformed. What remained was something else, something that hunted in the spaces between legal and illegal, moral and immoral, necessary and monstrous. She had no name now, no identity except the one she created for each mission, no existence except in the nightmares of men who sold children and poisoned communities and thought their money made them gods. The businessman stepped onto his balcony for his nightly cigarette, punctual as always, reliable in his vices, and she took the shot without hesitation, watching him fold like origami, becoming art in his destruction. By the time his security found him, she would be gone, dissolved into Tokyo's millions, another ghost in a city full of them. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Another name, another city, another monster that needed to be introduced to mortality. She deleted the message without saving it, knowing there would always be another, and another, and another. An endless procession of evil that required an equal and opposite reaction. Newton's third law applied to human morality. She thought about Lily, safe in her boarding school, growing into a woman who would never know what her mother had become, what had been done to preserve that innocence. What continued to be done in the shadows so that people like her could live in the light? It was enough, Sarah told herself, as she disappeared into the Tokyo night. It had to be enough, because in the end, that was what she had learned in those 8 months of emptiness, in the warehouse where she had been reborn in blood, in the years since when she had become the thing that hunted monsters, that sometimes the only way to protect the light was to become the darkness, to be the ghost in the machine of evil, the glitch in the system that reminded predators they could also be prey. She had been a woman, a mother, an agent, a victim, a survivor, and finally, a weapon. Now she was none of those things, and all of them, existing in the spaces between definitions, neither alive nor dead, neither good nor evil, just necessary in the way that darkness was necessary to define light, that death was necessary to give meaning to life, that monsters were necessary to remind us what it meant to be human. The city swallowed her whole, and she let it, becoming part of its circulation, another cell in its body, moving through its arteries toward the next mission, the next target, the next necessary evil that would prevent a greater evil, world without end, amen. In a boarding school in Massachusetts, Lily Chen wrote an essay about her mother, the federal agent who had died in the line of duty, a hero who had sacrificed everything for justice. Every word was a lie and every word was true, because Sarah Chen, the hero, was dead. But what remained? The ghost she had become would continue the work until there was no work left to do, or until something finally put her down like the dangerous animal she had become. Either way, Lily would be safe, and that was enough. That was everything. That was worth becoming a monster.